Hey, good afternoon, everyone. In U.S. history and American political science, I'm going to put up a quick video about the executive, the presidency. We're in that chapter right now, chapter 12, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of it and how it's evolved over time. And I'll try to keep it short because I know everybody shows me a video. If it's more than 5 minutes, I try to avoid it as best I can. But the executive, we know Article 1 is the legislature in our forefathers, our framers of our Constitution, meant for the legislature to be the most salient or important part of our government at its inception. And we know that's evolved over time, that the presidency has grown, and that's the executive. Article 1, the legislature, to pass laws. And in a real thumbnail approach, if you say, well, what's the executive? Well, that's Article 2. It goes right in order. Article 2 is the executive, the president. Just for like a most cut and dry definition of what the executive does is it's the enforcement wing of law. They implement and enforce law. Now, does it do more than that? Sure. Well, how do we know what it does? First, we looked at a document, the Constitution, and it lists the powers of the president. Basically, they are the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. They are the administrative wing of enforcing law. They also are the main interpreter of foreign affairs. And if we go through the actual article, it would certainly behoove us because it's generally understood that they have the power to enter into treaties, but only with the consent of the Senate, not the whole Congress, just the Senate. And that's part of the checks and balances we have in the system. But when the framers were first starting to create the Constitution or the framework of government, there were some real concerns about, do we want just one individual? Because we know there was concern over tyranny. We didn't want one person or group of people to have too much power in our nation. So initially, some of the debate was about, should we have maybe a council of people to be part of the executive, maybe, like a committee. And maybe they would have the power to even veto state law. There was talk about what their role would be. What would their title be? Some actually talked about calling them king, but that would suggest a monarchy. We certainly didn't want that. And ultimately, they determined it should be one person. They serve for a 4-year term. And as a check on raw democracy, they created that very complicated electoral college that most people don't really seem to be very fond of based upon fairly recent polling. Even I'm troubled by it because it's a bit ambiguous, not so much about its structure, but about the definiteness of it, meaning that if an elector is chosen for Massachusetts, for example, this most current election, and say the 13 electors for Massachusetts are basically picked by the Democratic Party because the Democrat won the state of Massachusetts. Leadership from the party will pick the electors to go to the state house in December. Each state will do that, and they're supposed to cast their vote based upon what the party suggests. But is it binding? There's some ambiguity about that, and it doesn't always reflect the popular vote. So sometimes a candidate will win the popular vote but lose the electoral college, and all that matters is what? The electoral college. And a lot of people think this is a archaic system and it's confusing and people don't quite get it and it's disenfranchising. Some votes are basically more powerful than others is the argument. And it's true. And that's what the framers intended. So there's sometimes an argument for the call for the end of the electoral college. I'm not so keen on it. I like one person, one vote. But when you get that, you start getting the more concentrated populations of our country. The cities will dominate presidential politics. But anyways, let's read it because that's always the best place to start. Article 2. Oh, no, I'm already reading the amendments. That's smart. If we go right to Article 2, which everyone should read and have read, it basically says, Article 2, of course I'm reading all the different powers of Congress. Article 2, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. What does that mean? That's open to discussion and debate, and we know presidents over time have expanded the argument and largely accepted by our society that their influence and power has grown. What's the one check on it? Well, Congress can potentially check the president with the purse strings or pass legislation altering a presidential course potentially, and the other is the Supreme Court basically interpreting Article 2 of the United States Constitution as prohibiting the president from doing or failing to do certain types of behavior. But it says, shall be vested in the President of the United States. He shall hold his office for a term of 4 years, and together with the vice president chosen the same term, be elected as follows. And then they talk about the electoral college. But then it goes on about their qualifications and what they shall do. It gives very, very little definition of what their job is. They talk about that they have to be how old? 35 years of age. They have to be a natural born citizen, and there's been some court interpretation of what that means. You actually might be able to be born on foreign soil, but if you're a child of a military active service member, that might qualify you still to be considered a naturally born United States citizen. And it's in Section 2, basically given the powers. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called upon in the actual service of the United States. And it also about pardoning when it comes to federal offenses only. Power in the advice of the Senate to make treaties. So it's always been the extension of the president to be the chief negotiator of foreign affairs. But with what? The consent of the Senate. That's huge. They can do executive agreements, meaning the president agree with something with France, and if the Congress doesn't go along, the Senate, they can have this executive order, and it's only valid or basically followed during the term of the presidency of that individual president. Getting a little complicated there. And they also shall nominate, with the advice of the Senate again, ambassadors, public ministers, judges to the Supreme Court and of all the lower courts in our federal system. And the heads of all the federal agencies will also be picked by the president. And we know the president has this gap when the Senate's not in session. The president can actually appoint temporary officers to these different positions, but they expire if the Senate doesn't approve them during the next session of the Senate. They'll do the State of the Union. That's not that big a deal. Well, it's a big deal, but it's not that big a deal in terms of power, what they can actually engage in doing. And then it talks about impeachment. Really kind of vague, right? And initially, our framers thought the president should be relatively, weak, do the bidding of Congress, enforce the law. Where that changed over time was largely with the tool of the war powers, because the president is the chief executive and the commander-in-chief of the military. It has been times where there have been wars that have not been declared by Congress. It's only Congress that has the power to declare war, and that hasn't been done since World War II. But there have been many conflicts that the military has been engaged in since John Adams with the war against the French, very small, called the Quasi-War. And there were other, Thomas Jefferson. So there's all these different, and Thomas Jefferson purchasing the Louisiana Purchase, clearly unconstitutionally, but Thomas Jefferson noted that. But he took this as the powers vested in the presidency allowed me to engage in those kinds of conduct. And the Congress was on board anyways. If you really wanted to get into the analysis of presidential power, generally speaking, it's at its strongest point when Congress is either overtly in agreement with the president's action or implicitly in agreement, like they're not basically condemning his or her conduct. Well, it's been his up until this point, right? In the time the president's the weakest is when he tries to act in contravention of Congress's will. That's when it's called ebb tide, if you will. And there's case law on it. And who tells us what this means? The Supreme Court. So if the president takes an action and someone challenges that action, so the president, you can't do that, well, who's to decide? And we have these controversies all the time, and it's not about whether the president's a good guy or a bad guy. It's about whether they have the power. Because I think most presidents think they're doing what's in the best interest of the country. But if you as a citizen don't like what the president's doing, what do we often say? That president's acting like a tyrant. They're acting like a king, or they're acting like a dictator, and we need to stop it. And the way we do is we challenge it in court. In every president throughout history, except one, Andrew Jackson, during the removal of the Cherokee Nation from Georgia, every president has acknowledged when the Supreme Court says, President, you can't do that. Presidents have reluctantly, sometimes bitterly, accepted, grumblingly, if you will, the rulings of the Supreme Court. So that's what happens to this day, is the president might take an executive order, try to do something, and says, hey, that's out of your jurisdiction. It's out of your power as either commander-in-chief or as an enforcer of the law. You're stretching your authority with these executive orders and things like that. That's what they usually call them, executive orders, basically a law created by the president. And they get challenged, and they often do get shot down as being unconstitutional. The best example I can think of, and I have a video, I don't know if I can find it, but I can tell you the case. It's Youngstown Steel versus Harry Truman. Harry Truman's the president of the United States. It's during the Korean conflict, the Korean War, right? But it wasn't an official war. The steel mills were having a union crisis or labor crisis. and they couldn't resolve it. And Harry Truman says, we need steel for the military effort, tanks, guns, planes, all that kind of stuff. And it's stymieing our effort, supposedly, in the Korean Peninsula. And so Harry Truman said, I had enough. The companies can't come to terms with the labor unions. I'm taking over the steel industry. And he did, and he took it over. And one of the owners of one of the steel industries was actually a Harvard Law School educated individual, very wealthy, very wise. It wasn't like he had a hammer and a bunch of iron ore and was making steel. These people that own the steel industries were often very erudite and educated, and they took it to the Supreme Court. And he says, not against the President of the United States, but against the Harry Truman, the dictator, who doesn't have the power to take over the steel industry. Nowhere in the powers of the Constitution does he have it. Harry Truman's counter was, I am commander-in-chief of the military services, and taking over the steel industry is in relation to my role as president. And his quote was, a president can't let the country go to hell. It's their obligation not to. Supreme Court shot him down 6-3. It says, President Truman, you don't have the power to take over the steel industry. He got embarrassed. He got shot down, and he had to give up control of that. And he had to hope that the steel industry could negotiate with labor union and increase production and affordability of steel for the military. So sometimes presidents try to act beyond their control. Lincoln did. Lincoln got away with it. Many of the things Lincoln did during the time of the Civil War were very popular in hindsight, but many of them were probably unconstitutional. Some were actually ruled unconstitutional, but after the Civil War had resolved the conflict and the controversies at the time. But most people applaud, Lincoln basically taking control and exercising power. And that's sort of the irony of it. If it's somebody like Lincoln, we applaud it, but I don't want to say other names, but if it's another president that tries to take power into their own hands, like Harry Truman in his own time wasn't nearly as popular as was years after. In hindsight, my father hated Harry Truman because he made my father do an extra year in the Navy during the Korean War, automatic extension. And he was furious at Harry Truman. I always hated Harry Truman, and I always kind of liked him, mostly to tease my dad. But Harry Truman also tried to take power beyond that which the president was, but it was very unpopular and it didn't work very well. Lincoln did it. Every president who's not passive, who really thinks it's in their role to try to take action, does. Some presidents, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had Congress on his side, but even still, he got shot down, and the Congress did as well, by the court, saying he just didn't have the authority, both Congress and the president, to take certain action as part of his recovery plan. Later, the court moved more into his direction and supported some of the views, and not supported, but approved constitutionally some of the actions he was taking. But it's largely through military effort and national calamity that presidents have been able to expand their national power, or doing things like the Louisiana Purchase, which was extremely popular. Sometimes a president will take action that's so popular that people just don't dare challenge it because it's so beneficial to the country as a whole. And then when we ever had these military skirmishes, whether it's Vietnam, although popular in its exception, was certainly not popular in its end, and Congress eventually reeled in the Vietnam conflict because we never had a declaration of war, and we thought that was enough. Enough's enough. And but presidents have a great deal of power through what we call the war powers to basically engage military in times of crisis without congressional consent. And the only way Congress can reel that in is through the power of the purse, basically limiting funding for those kind of military excursions. But the initial startup of a war or a conflict tends to be very popular, and the president can sway public opinion like nobody else. And one of the most influential characters in that, whether you like his politics or not, was FDR. FDR would do these things called fireside chats and other types of meetings because he had the bully pulpit. He's one person who's got the attention of the media and of the populace. And when he says things, and if he says it well, he gets the backing of the people. And if the people back the president's moves, it tends to put pressure on Congress to assent to what the president is doing because they're popular directives. Again, the president does not pass law. He does what? He enforces the law. But can he put together a legislative package and put pressure on Congress to move in a certain way? Yes. That's why I personally find it kind of funny when I watch presidential debates. I'm thinking back when it was Obama versus Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney said the first thing he's going to do when he's in office is he's going to repeal Obamacare. Well, that might be his goal, but who repeals law is the same who makes law, and that's the legislature. He may have a legislative agenda, but he has to introduce it through Congress. That's the checks and balances. So sometimes when we support candidates, we hear them saying the first thing we do in the 100 days when I'm the president is this, that, and the other thing. But they may not have what? They might not have congressional backing, and they may not have independent authority to do things because they don't have the money to fund it, or they simply don't have the power in the Constitution to do it. And most of us think the president's omnipotent. They can do whatever they want. It's not true. They've often been pushed back. Now, some of the more fun, testable things is how long can you be a president? We know, or what's the eligibility of being president? You have to be 35 years old. You have to remember back in the day when the Constitution was created, 35 years old was a, I don't want to say elderly man, but was a very mature person in terms of age and terms of professional career at that time. And because they were concerned about foreign influences, not that foreign necessarily means negative, but there was always that concern. Someone would just come up that had more of a loyalty to a foreign nation that they were born in than their basically nation of birth, that they wanted people who were naturally born in the United States to only be eligible to become president of the United States, with the exception that it had to be prospective, meaning when they wrote the Constitution in 1789, when it was adopted, anybody who was then a naturalized citizen, they were eligible to run for president. But going forward, it had to be people who were born here. And occasionally there's talk of that changing when there's somebody who's very popular who may have been born and for a young age was in a foreign country, became a United States citizen. Why can't they be eligible? Well, the Constitution says you're not. Could we amend it? We could. There was a period of time when a guy by the name of Arnold Schwarzenegger was an extremely popular politician. His popularity fell way off after, I think it was his second term as governor of California. But for a while there, he thought, he might have a shot to become president of the United States in terms of popularity. But he would be barred because he was not born in the United States. He was born in, I think, Australia. Could be Germany, but somewhere in that region. He's a United States citizen, but he was not naturalized. He wasn't a natural born citizen of the United States. Interesting requirement, but that's one. The other's 35. We want people who are, back then we thought 35 was mature. We haven't had a president who's 35. Youngest president we've ever had elected was Teddy Roosevelt. I think shortly thereafter is maybe JFK. Then Obama was pretty young too. Most of our presidents have been all of them I think have been over 40. But you can run for president at the age of 35. Some people say we should make it much younger. Well, I guess, but if you have to amend the Constitution. But secondly, is I don't know if somebody who's very young is going to get the votes of a lot of people. A lot of people want maturity and experience. I think that counts for a lot. Not always. We'd like to think it might. The other is that you're only eligible to serve 2 elected terms. That's fairly new. That came out in 1950 something and change. I might as well tell you what the amendment is right now. I think it's the 17th. Let's see how good I am. Is it the 17th Amendment? It is the 13th. 17th Amendment. No. It's not. It is the... I wish I gave the dates and I could find it right away. Which amendment was it? It's embarrassing. A note passed in the 1950s, and I can't find the specific amendment, which basically nullified. There's the 14th. We know it was much later than 14. 20. I think it's Amendment 20, actually. But anyways, I'm way off track, and now the video is terrible. I should erase it, start all over. But it was because of FDR. He was elected to 4 terms. Most people look back during that era, if you lived in an era, worshiping FDR. A great many people, if you watch the PBS special about the Roosevelts, covered Teddy, but it also covered, obviously, Eleanor and Eleanor's wife, Franklin. And my trivia question, what was Eleanor Roosevelt's maiden name before she married Franklin Roosevelt? Roosevelt. They're actually cousins. But anyways, Franklin Roosevelt won 4 consecutive terms by election, and I actually collect political memorabilia. I don't know if I have any in front of me that are pins because I never put them away. I think I have a third term pin up here somewhere in one of them. I have some that say no 3rd term, no 4th term. I don't want King, Roosevelt, all those things, because it was getting concerned that that's what the framers didn't want, was this conglomeration of power on one individual for too long. And there was a custom, but that's all it was a custom since Washington, never to serve more than 2 elected terms. Franklin Delano Roosevelt broke that, and he was extremely popular during his period of time in the presidency. And if you watch the PBS special, and I can give an example from my own life, how popular he was with the common people of the United States, it was really quite remarkable. There are some people that died in that era not too long after FDR had died. He died just before the close of World War II. And when he died, the nation really wept for him. Common people did, because he helped bring us through the Depression and helped win World War II as the bully pulpit, the leader of our nation. And that's what we look to the president when there's national calamity or war. We look to the president to lead us through it. And after he died, people were really deeply moved, and people who themselves were dying shortly thereafter on the PBS special say, well, after when I pass, I'm looking forward to meeting Franklin Roosevelt, as if he was like an archangel or something that would meet you in heaven. He was that well beloved. But the story from my own life is one of my closest friends' father had lived through the Depression as a young man, a very young man, and thought the world of FDR. They took him to Hyde Park. Hyde Park is in New York, where FDR grew up and had a home, and there's a library there, a museum. And he went in there, and the story is so beautiful to me that my friend's father just, broke down emotionally, started crying over seeing the symbolism of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because he was that big an iconic figure in the American psyche for those people that grew up in that era. Really incredible. And but the concern was, even if he does a great job, even if it's FDR, even if it's, I don't know who the next president will be that will have great popularity because they worked so hard and were so popular, should we allow them a third term? And the American consensus was no. We don't want people to stay in power that long. And there's talk about doing that to U.S. senators and Congress people, but we haven't yet. Right now, you can keep doing 2-year terms ad nauseum in the House of Representatives, and you can keep doing the same with the 6-year terms in the U.S. Senate. We've had some senators serve for over 40 years. So the president now can only serve 2 elected terms. And the old trick question was, you can never serve, true or false, you can never serve more than 8 years as a president of the United States. That's false, because it's 2 elected terms. You might inherit part of a previous term. Like, say, for example, Teddy Roosevelt almost pulled it off. He did the remainder of McKinley's. McKinley got assassinated. Teddy Roosevelt was the vice president. He becomes president. Then he wins the election in his own right in 1904. He did not run in 1908, but then he ran again in 1912. Why could he do it? Well, the amendment wasn't passed, first of all. But second, to say it was, could he have? Yeah, he could have. Same with Lyndon Baines Johnson. He did the last year of John F. Kennedy's presidency, got elected in his own right in 1964, and then in 1968 decided not to run for re-election. But he could have. He could have served basically 9 years in effect. Any other requirements of the presidency? Well, what other checks are there in the presidency? Well, one is the Congress can override the veto of the president. The veto is a very powerful thing. Andrew Jackson helped grow the power of the presidency, because presidents before him said, if it's the will of the Congress, we're going to do it. Andrew Jackson goes, I don't care if it's the will of the Congress. If I think it's wrong, I'm vetoing it. He vetoed more than all the presidents before him combined. That's how he grew the strength of the presidency, by vetoing legislation that he didn't think was wise or appropriate. So the veto power is very important for the president, because they can stop legislation they don't think is appropriate or reasonable. But the thing that the Congress has to check a president that might be unruly or inappropriate is to override their veto. And that's 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate. But the other powerful tool, which is seldom used, is impeachment. The Congress has the power to remove the president through an impeachment process. We've had 3 presidents now that have been impeached. All impeachment is just being charged. How you get charged is the House of Representatives, by just majority vote, can impeach a president by determining that, in their view, the president has either committed high crimes or misdemeanors and should be removed from office. What is a high crime? What is a misdemeanor? It's not exactly clear what the president has to do arguably wrong before they're impeached. The 3 presidents that we've had impeached, which is just simply a charge, is Andrew Johnson, the president after Abe Lincoln, Bill Clinton for perjury, because he perjured himself over his affair with Monica Lewinsky, and then most recently Donald Trump over his dealings with some quid pro quo with Ukraine, trying to get dirt on Biden or something like that. Now, just because these 3 presidents were charged, none of them were convicted. Why? Because where does the conviction come from? The Senate. Andrew Johnson came within 1 or 2 votes, very close. That's the closest we ever came to removing a president through impeachment. And I'm glad it didn't happen. I'm no Andrew Johnson fan, but if he did get impeached, it would have made Congress so omnipotent and the president so weak, it would have ruined the checks and balances because he was being removed for a very trivial matter, quite frankly. The next one, Bill Clinton, didn't come close. He was impeached by the House, but the Senate came nowhere near the 2/3 requirement for him perjuring himself over the Monica Lewinsky affair. And similarly with Donald Trump, they had no problem indicting him, impeaching him, but the Senate came nowhere near 2/3 of the vote to remove him from office. It's a tool that should not be lightly used. It should only be used in the most egregious of circumstances because it rattles the nation's confidence in our government if people are saying the president is corrupt and a criminal and should be removed. It's not done very often. But other than those requirements, what the president's supposed to do and not do is a bit vague. And like anybody else, if you're given power and you think there's a need to help your country or change your country and move your country in a certain way, presidents have the bully pulpit. They're one person and they're in control of significant agencies. All these federal agencies have grown exponentially over our 200 and some odd years of a country existence, and they can control policy like nobody else. And they appoint these heads of different agencies, and they have the power to fire. That's why sometimes Donald Trump gets picked on a lot because he appoints people, and then shortly thereafter he fires them. Can he? Absolutely. They serve at the will and the discretion of the president. It's not always good practice, I don't think, to kind of keep flipping people in and out of office. But think about it. If you want your FDA or your environmental czar that runs those different administrative agencies to move in a certain direction, they don't, you remove them and you appoint people that you want to do. And they have huge power over the courts. They nominate justices to the Supreme Court and all the federal bench all the way through top to bottom. They do so with all the different agencies. A significant amount of power. What's the check on the president? The Senate. And a lot of people say, well, the Senate rarely rejects a presidential appointment. That's true. They rarely do, but it's because the president is well aware that these important governmental roles that they have the ability to appoint people to are going to be reviewed by the Senate. You're likely to pick candidates that are going to be able to pass through the process. Occasionally they don't, and that's a risk a president takes because I think it weakens their position if their candidates don't ultimately get approved. But President Trump, there's no mistaking it. He's gotten several members of the judiciary appointed during his presidency, got to pass through the Senate. And his philosophical view, arguably, justices are appointed for life, so they may well change from what the prediction is in terms of the political philosophy, but he's gotten several through, and that's the power of the presidency. They can help control the court. So when I vote for a president, I think about all the different things they can do in terms of appointing people to the courts, to the federal agencies, and how they're going to potentially enter into foreign treaties. Because although they can do it on their own, it's not enforceable unless the Senate approves it. But still, they have a lot of control, and they can sway public opinion like no other official can, because they are the pinnacle of power in our governmental sort of framework as an individual. I still think Congress historically was meant to be more powerful, but over time the presidential power has grown significantly. It's the most prized seat in all the political realm. Bit long. I talk a lot. I love talking about the presidency, and we know the Electoral College is a bit controversial, but I hope that's helped summarize from that chapter. I'm going to put up a little homework assignment related to it, and otherwise I hope you be well.